Now, the microphone is working, and I am ready to work. Well, the next person that I hear talking in the audience is going to take my place here and share their thoughts with everybody. Well, today we have a very interesting prophet to discuss, and his name is Hosea. Hosea. The reason that I think it's very interesting, because he's really the only prophet about whom we have a great deal of information about his personal life, because it was events in his personal life that led him to become a prophet. Hosea lived in the northern kingdom of Israel about the year 600, at a time when Israel was being threatened by the mightiest military force in the ancient world, and that was Assyria. The book begins with the story of his personal life. So let's take a look at it. The very beginning of chapter 1. The initial speech of God with Hosea. God said to Hosea, "Go take unto yourself a wife of harlotry, and beget children of harlotry. For the land is straying completely from following God." So he went and he took Gomer, and she conceived and bore him a son. And God said to him, "Call his name Jezreel, for in a short while I will avenge the blood of Jezreel upon the house of Jehu, and I will terminate the monarchy of the house of Israel. It will happen on that day that I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel." Now, what I want to note is this. What in the world is going on? In other words, the book could have started this way. And Hosea took unto himself a wife of harlotry, and she conceived unto him a son. In other words, lots of people in life make a mistake. Sometimes they marry the wrong person with their first marriage. She's beautiful, attractive, sexy, and they get married. That happens. But here in this book of Hosea, what he's saying is, God told him to do that. Now, why in the world would God tell anybody, go marry a prostitute? Wouldn't God have said, I want you to marry a nice Jewish girl? That's the big question to start with that I want you to think about. Then the Bible goes on to say, and she conceived again and bore a daughter. And God told him, call her Lo Ruchama. And I will no longer pity the house of Israel. Ruchama means mercy. In Yiddish, we say Rachmanis, mercy. Call her unmercied. Now, when you have a baby, the feelings that any normal parent would have for a baby is certainly to be merciful to that baby, to do whatever you can to make the baby happy. You wrap the baby up when it's cold. You feed the baby when it's hungry. Here he's telling Hosea, now name your second child, Lo Ruchama. Namely, nobody cares for you. Charming introduction. And then he goes on to say, for I will no longer pity the house of Israel, that I should show them forbearance. Then it goes on to say, she weaned Lo Ruchama, and she conceived and bore a son. Still sounds like a nice, happy family. A third child, a boy. And God tells them to name the child Lo Ami. You're not my people. You don't belong here. What's going on, this beautiful Jewish family? Goes on to say, for you are not my people, and I will not be yours. Yet the number of the children of Israel will be like the sand of the sea, which can neither be measured nor counted. And it will happen that will be said of them, children of the living God. This is at a time when There's a large Jewish population, and she's going to name her child Lo Ami, or not my people, because it's a reference to this land of Israel. You are not my people because you have wandered away from worshiping me. Then he says, say to your brothers, Ami, and your sisters, Ruchama. No, I skipped a line. The children of Judah and the children of Israel will be assembled together, and they will appoint for themselves one head, and I will ascend from the land, for the day of Jezreel is great. Say to your brothers, Ami, you are my people, and your sisters, Ruchama, you are pitied, you are beloved. Contend with your mother. Contend, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband. And have her remove her harlotry from her face, and her adulteries from between her breasts, lest I strip her bare, and she stand as on the day she was born, and make her like a wilderness, and wither her like a parched land, and I cause her to die of thirst, and upon her children I will not have mercy, for they are children of harlotry, for their mother has committed harlotry. She who conceived them has shamed herself. A complete breakdown of the family. They have 3 children, and then the bubble bursts. Hosea no longer can stand the fact that his wife has really abandoned him and gone to other gods. That pretty much looks like the end of the road for that family. And yet, as we read on, well, it goes on, therefore, behold, I will head your way with thorns, and I will hem her in with a fence, and she will not find her path. She will pursue her paramours, but not reach them. She will seek them, but not find them. Then she will say, I will go and return to my first husband, for it was better for me then than it is now. She did not realize that it was I who gave her the grain and the wine and the oil. I lavished silver and gold upon her. But they used it for the Baal, the foreign god. Therefore, I will return and take my grain in its time, and my silver in the season. And I will remove my wool and my linen that I gave her. And now I will reveal her repulsiveness before the eyes of her paramours. And no more will save her from my hand. I will terminate her every rejoicing, her festival, her new moon, her Shabbat. I will lay waste her wine and her fig tree. They are payment for me that my paramours have given me, and I will make them like a forest, and the beasts of the field will devour them. And I will repay her for all the days of the Baalim, that she adorned herself with earrings and so on. Therefore, I will seduce her and will lead her to the desert, and I will speak to her heart, and I will give her her vineyard from there, and make the valley of Achor into a portal of hope. That's the story. She betrayed him, and he's going to punish her and take away from her all that she had enjoyed during her life with him. And finally, she'll come to the realization that she has really destroyed herself. And she goes back to her husband and pleads for forgiveness. And he will forgive her, and he will lead her from the valley of Achor to Petach Tikva, the gate of hope. He will lead her back into the wonderful days that they had had together, and they will resume a beautiful life. That's a story for a Netflix film. A very nice film. But what Hosea does is makes that a paradigm for God's relationship with the Jewish people. Look what God did with the Jewish people. He brought them out of slavery in Egypt. He brought them through the wilderness of Sinai, and then gave them the 10 Commandments at Sinai, brought them to a land of milk and honey. And what did they do when they got into the land of milk and honey? Began to worship Baal. Began to worship idolatry. And God will punish them severely for it. And eventually, they will realize what they had done. And they will return to me and ask me to take her back. And I will. And I will bring her from Emek Achor, the valley of evil, to the gate of hope. Now that always has been for me personally one of the greatest verses in the Bible, because Petach Tikva means so much to me. My great-grandfather came from Hungary and founded the first settlement in Israel. And he called the name of that settlement Petach Tikva, today the fourth largest city in Israel. And he did it because the establishment of Petach Tikva was a demonstration that the Jewish people have come home. And their Father has welcomed them in love and has forgiven them. So the theme that I'm really going to be talking about is love and forgiveness. Christine Hayes puts it this way, a little bit differently, but essentially the same. What she says is there were two covenants with God and the Jewish people. One was the Sinaitic covenant, and the other was the Davidic covenant. The Sinaitic covenant said, I'm giving you the law of God. If you obey it, you will be blessed. If you violate it, you will be cursed. Pretty simple. The Davidic covenant said, I give you, David, the rule over my people forever, no matter what, forever. No matter what, one of your descendants will be the Messiah, and he will bring salvation to our people. Well, in terms of the Jewish people, what went on in the thousands of years, 2,000 years, that the Jews were exiled from the land of Israel, the story of their life was purely a story of pain and suffering. They were always a minority, almost always a persecuted minority. And finally, there arose within the Jewish people a movement to reestablish their own homeland in the land of Israel. Petach Tikva meant that the Jewish people had come back to the Ottoman Empire, still a persecuted minority under the Ottoman Turks. And despite all of the pressure that the Turks exerted on the population of Palestine, they still built a Jewish settlement, and they called it Petach Tikva. This is the gate of hope. This is not the hope, but this is the entry to the future. And look what's happened since. Anybody who has been in Israel can testify to the tremendous growth and beauty and power of Israel. It's almost beyond belief. So what Hosea was saying was that no matter what a terrible thing has happened to me, I've lost my wife, I've lost my children, and yet there is a gate of hope. I've never given up. What Hosea was saying in those early days is a kind of a lesson that is so important to us in our own world today. What Hosea was saying was that the Davidic Covenant is in operation. Namely, you are going to suffer greatly. Now, this was the view of Jewish leaders. I personally don't necessarily accept that view. In other words, it would be hard to persuade me that the Jewish people were exiled, driven out of the land of Israel by the Romans in the year 70, because they had sinned so much. You know why they were driven out by the Romans? Because the Romans were so powerful. And Rome didn't just conquer Palestine. They conquered the whole known world at that time. And Assyria did not just conquer Israel, they conquered the entire Middle East. But the prophet interpreted all of that as being God's punishment to the Jewish people for their going astray. I cannot subscribe at all to the notion that was sounded when the Nazi regime began, voiced by a Rabbi Shach, an ultra-Orthodox rabbi in Israel, who said, "Do you know why the Nazis have taken over in Germany and have built this vast military machine that was threatening to take all of Europe and ultimately the entire world, because Jews have not been observing Jewish law. Jews have stopped eating kosher. Jews have stopped observing the Shabbat. Jews have stopped fasting on Yom Kippur, etc., etc. And if I had the opportunity, I would have told Rabbi Shach, that's a lie what you are saying. You can't put the tragedy of the Holocaust and blame the Jewish people for it. It was Nazism. It was Hitler. But that was the notion that's reflected here in Hosea. But what's more important than that idea is what Hosea said about the power of love and forgiveness. Now, think to yourself, what event took place that for the first time made real the notion of a Jewish homeland in Israel? The idea for 2,000 years was inconceivable. This little people driven out of Palestine, scattered all over the world, subject to the kind of anti-Semitism that they suffered. How in the world can you even imagine that they will one day have a Jewish state? So, what was the event? How did that begin? What took place in the world?
Balfour?
What?
Balfour?
No. The Balfour Declaration was only an expression of hope, support. But when was the Balfour Declaration issued? Remember what year? 1917. And it was commonly understood to be a method by which the Allies could use the influence of the Jews of America to get America involved in the First World War on the side of Great Britain and France. But not long after that, in 1922, what happened? What? I'm sorry? Well, anyway, let me tell you, I can't hear too well. In 1922, the League of Nations, which was formed after the First World War, met. And one of the tasks of the League of Nations was to decide what to do with the Ottoman Empire, which had joined the war on the side of Germany. At a League of Nations meeting, the nations of the world discussed and decided that that part of the Ottoman Empire, Palestine, should be set aside as a home for the Jewish people. Great Britain would be given the mandate to govern that land with the view of eventually its becoming the Jewish national home. That's what was legally determined by the League of Nations. Why did they do that? After all, they were a very small portion of the Middle East. The overwhelmingly large portion of the Middle East was Arab. They had the oil. Why do a thing like that? To give it to the Jews? The League of Nations. There is little doubt in anyone's mind. The reason they did it was because of the whole history of Europe of anti-Semitism and the feeling that the Jewish people deserved a place in which they could be the masters of their own destiny. And this was reinforced by the United Nations. When the United Nations met in 1947 and made a decision that not only was this going to be the Jewish national home, but it was going to be a Jewish state. That was their decision. And the reinforcement was the fact you not only had centuries of anti-Semitism to atone for, but you had the Holocaust, which had just ended, where 6 million Jews died. And that was the way the world atoned for that great sin. In other words, just looking at Jewish history, in order for ultimately there had to emerge a state of Israel, there apparently had to go through a long period of suffering. Now, I had the interesting experience just this last week on Tuesday. I've got a Talmud class. We're studying one of the books of the Talmud called Avodah Zarah, where they discuss interesting problems. Here's what they discussed. How do you explain the strange people, the Jewish people? What's wrong with their seichel? Here they are, slaves in Egypt, which is quite understandable. Egypt had lots of slaves. And along comes Moses and tells them, I'm going to free you. And he tells Pharaoh, let my people go. And after a series of miraculous events, the 10 plagues, sure enough, it happens. Pharaoh lets his people go. And when they went, they came to the Red Sea, and through a miracle, they crossed the Red Sea, which parted before them. Wow. You got to be impressed. And then they come to Mount Sinai, and they hear God's voice telling them the 10 Commandments. Wow, wow, wow. You really got to be impressed. And then, a day later, because Moses is not around, he's up on the mountain, they build a golden calf and worship it instead of God. Is that Meshuggah or not? What got into them? How do you explain it? One of the rabbis that we studied on Tuesday said, and on first reading of it, I was shocked. He said, you know why the Jews worship the golden calf? Because God wanted them to. What? God wanted the Jews to worship the golden calf? What am I reading? Then they go on to explain, why would God want them to worship the golden calf? Explain it. Explain it. Make sense out of it. Here's what he said. The rabbi said, God wanted them to worship the golden calf so that they would be punished and that they would repent and they would realize the power of repentance. The power of repentance. People have to learn to forgive. There isn't anybody here, including me, who hasn't at some time or other been angry at someone. Who did something that I thought was wrong, and I was furious. You know what I did once years ago? I sat down and wrote 3 letters to 3 people of the congregation who I knew were angry at me for whatever reason I didn't know. And I said, I know that you are unfriendly to me, and I want to apologize to you for whatever I did. I don't know what I did, but I want to apologize for it and put an end to this feeling. 2 of them responded favorably. But it was very important for me to do that. We have to learn to apologize. And we, even more importantly, have to learn to accept an apology. Let me give you an example of that in modern times that was really of great importance. After the Second World War, after the Holocaust, the chairman or the chancellor of Germany was Konrad Adenauer. Konrad Adenauer did a remarkable thing. I'm sure that many of you remember that. He offered the Jewish people reparations for the Holocaust. You couldn't bring them back to life, all of the victims. You couldn't restore all of the buildings, the synagogues, the community centers, orphanages, old folks' homes, and so on. But you could offer compensation. And he offered what was at that time an enormous amount of money to the state of Israel as reparations. And he offered to every individual who had suffered losses in terms of personal reparations. I don't know, I'm looking around here, but I do know that I knew a number of people in Portland who received reparations from the German government. There was an uproar in the Jewish world. The outcry was, blood money. You're going to take money to atone for the lives of all the victims in the Holocaust? For all the institutions that were destroyed? How can you forgive them? And it was David Ben-Gurion who stood up to all of the criticism, and he says, it's so important for us to have this money now. Because what was going on in Israel? Israel was bringing in refugees, particularly from neighboring Arab countries. They were living in ma'abarot. They were living in tent cities. The most difficult conditions imaginable. And they desperately needed help. And they needed funds for relief, for food, for clothing, for training. I'm going to accept the reparations. And Germany became one of Israel's staunchest allies. Now, put this in these terms. Hosea had suffered a tremendous loss. Obviously, he had loved his wife when he married her. She betrayed him. He must have gone through agonies. Picture to myself, he was sitting at home, listening to all the celebrations of Baal worship and imagining, your mind runs wild when you're in love. That Gomer is out there dancing with all of these Baal worshipers, and God knows what else she's doing. The pain and the anger that must have gone through his mind and heart are unimaginable. And yet, when it was over, it was over. You build your life again. Now, let me just read to you or I'll say it by heart because I know it so well. What we do today that reinforces that idea. What's written right here in the same chapter, and you can read it better than I can read it for you. It says here, I betroth thee unto me forever. I betroth you unto me. B'tzedek u'b'mishpat u'b'chesed u'b'rachamim. In righteousness and in justice and in mercy and in love. V'yiratzich li le'olam, v'yiratzich li b'tzedek v'chesed v'rachamim, v'yiratzich li le'olam, b'nei Adonai Elohim, the eyes of God. In other words, some of you men especially will know this. When a Jew puts out his tefillin in the morning, he puts his tefillin on his arm, usually his left arm, so that the tefillin is next to the heart, and he puts it on his head, so it's next to his brain, and then he wraps the tefillin around the arm, and then around this finger. He wraps it around once, twice, a third time on this finger. And as he wraps it around, he says, Ve'irastech li le'olam, ve'irastech li b'chesed, v'tzedek v'rachamim, ve'irastech li le'olam, v'lecha shalom. In other words, do you know that every observant Jew who puts on his tefillin actually joins in a wedding ceremony with God? He puts a ring around his finger and he recites these words. You know, if you didn't put on tefillin, okay. But you know what would be very nice if you would do? If you could develop a ceremony where every day you marry your wife again. You tell her you love her. You tell her she means so much to you. You don't think it, but you say it. That's what a Jew does with God every day. He comes from the book of Hosea. So Hosea, who suffered so much from Gomer, enables us to this day to renew our love for God and God's love for us. So it's no wonder that I'm very entranced by the book of Hosea and urge you to read it. Now, any questions, comments?
Wait for the microphone, please.
Laurie?
No, you dropped something.
Oh,
Speak right into it.
All right. Rabbi, Miss Marianne,
oh yes.
I have a thought.
Okay.
And if I like to bring the concept of the particulars you're talking about into a more universal thought, I was thinking what you're actually saying. There's nothing certain in life. We all live with conflict. And to accept conflict in life graciously is actually what you're saying in a more biblical way.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Anyone? Okay. Next week, Isaiah.